Hello and welcome to another video. So today we're actually going to be taking a look at about 9 decks here. We're going to take a look at all of these because we have the lobby tournament in just a few hours from when this video is going live for you guys. So I wanted to cover the decks that I think will appear frequently and decks that are pretty strong at the moment, along with a couple of budget options down the bottom here with Haven and Sword, and we'll go over how a couple of these decks can be turned into budget decks. So first up, Spell Boost Rune. Definitely not one we can easily make budget, but an extremely solid deck. This has been carrying me through upper single A, where I've climbed through A2 and A3 at this stage with this deck. We're approaching double A very, very soon, hopefully. So this deck is extremely solid. You have Foresight and Stormy Blast, always good early game. It's really just about spell boosting and drawing early so that you can eventually get the Cocytus Dimensional Climb. You can get that combo to go off reasonably consistently, although I have found more consistency in just getting as much face damage as you can through Ann, Kun, Demonic Call, and Blaze Destroyers, and then just having this as a top end just in case sort of deal. So for the most part, you can push pretty aggressively with the early game stuff, and as long as you hold at least one super evolve for Cocytus towards the end, unless you absolutely need it to either win the game or stop yourself from losing, I would do it that way. And this deck has been, like I said, really solid for me. I think I'm currently on a 7 or 8 win streak with this deck now, without any sign of slowing down through Sapphire rank in A3. So that's a really, really nice deck overall and performs really, really well. Then we have probably one of the most popular decks of the format currently. We have the Aggro Sword deck. Aggro Sword, really, really popular. I'm not personally the biggest fan of it just because I don't enjoy how Aggro Sword plays typically, but it's no contest when it comes to how many wins this deck has. It's probably the most consistent deck for getting wins through ranking, and in the lobby tournament will probably also be a very consistent pick, especially if people have already got this deck and are using it to climb. So expect to see a decent chunk of Aggro Sword to try and scoop up early and fast wins during the lobby tournament. But you never know, maybe because it might end up being slow with stuff like Spell Boost and Haven, maybe we won't see this as much. Who knows, but we'll cover it anyway. So early game, just 2 drops basically. Mid to late game, you know, you go from your 3 drops with some Board Swarm and removal cards to your buff card in Zirconia, and then more Board Swarm in Luminous, to your big finishers like Albert, Geno, and more Board Swarm for mid to late game for Amelia. And then Olivia is just a really nice pickup. More and more decks seem to be trying to run 2 to 3 Olivia, so don't be surprised if you see Olivia in a lot of these decks. It's a very good card for putting pressure on the board through Super Evo, especially before going for a turn like Albert or Amelia or anything of the sort. So really nice deck, does do fairly well. Seen a lot of people have really good success, you know, 10 plus win streaks with this deck without any issue. So don't be surprised if this does pop up during the tournament. Then we have Aggro Dragon. I used this deck to climb through the late stages of like B3 and the early stages of A0 and A1. This deck was exceptionally good, honestly. If you want fast games and you're not a fan of how Aggro Sword plays, I feel like this plays better, in my opinion. Just dropping a couple of followers, getting the chip damage in, and then dropping your big, like, Storm follower, and then hitting off with Warrior the Deep for a finisher. I was running a version that had Gyaro in it, but a lot of decks are cutting that, just running more Olivia, and then focusing more on the early to mid-game areas instead of, like, the turn 8+ rounds, where you're not really in as big a trouble if you can just drop multiple Fortes and win the game. But, again, a very solid fan of Otome being the MVP here, getting you that Storm and Ward follower, just to help you chip damage away quickly. So very good deck. Again, performs really well. Had great success with this deck personally, and can highly recommend it if you've got the cards for it already. Then we have Stormhaven. I'm not the biggest fan of this deck, although when I was playing a variation of this deck, very, very similar to this, honestly, which if you've seen the videos on my channel recently, this deck is solid. It does the job. I would say it's more popular and more consistent than Fatigue Haven overall, although I am more into the control orientation of Fatigue Haven than the aggressive push of this deck, using like Winged and Pact and where's the other one? Avian Statue with the boosts from Jean. This deck, not too many options to go budget on, honestly, so you can't really do too much with it as far as that goes, I guess. Like, Fatigue Haven has a better job being budget than this deck typically does, but we do have a Haven deck that's very similar that is in the budget category, just running 3 Genes, so Very okay deck. Again, if you have the cards and you enjoy how Haven plays, can recommend it. Go for it. Give it a go. All these decks I've picked and choose because I could recommend these pretty easily overall, and that's a good sign. These are all decks that I've seen have 10 plus win rates through Shadowverse wins and been posted quite consistently, and I usually look for at least 2 or 3 people with similar lists that are posting them and getting similar win rates. Then we have Midrange Abyss. This deck has been popping off as of late, honestly. There are a few guys on the rankings right now covering 600 wins or so, and that's kind of insane, honestly, for Abyss, considering it was downtrodden quite a bit. I think this is now pretty much as good as it's going to get for Abyss until we get the next expansion. It's a more mid-range focused deck where you do drop some early stuff to kind of control, and then mid-game you just kind of start dropping out some bigger threats, and then by late game you're just dropping Cerberus and Medusa and Olivia for lethal plays, basically. Medusa is basically a card that your enemy has to clear because it's super threatening. Cerberus gets you a lot of value, and then the same with Olivia, it's just a lot of value. And then you can do things with like Devious Lesser Mummy for Storm, Ghost Summons with Storm, and a few other bits and pieces. But overall, very, very solid deck. Although, again, I didn't have much success running a Midrange Abyss, but hey, a lot of people have. Now we go on to Artifact Portal. Artifact Portal being probably the most versatile deck we have in the format. It's got a lot of options and a lot of things you can do with it. This one is more of the optimized list set, running a lot of the puppet engine stuff. So you run your Lovestruck puppets, you run your Orcus, and you kind of win that way. This one's running double cannon. You can kind of get away with one cannon if you wanted to mess around with adding different cards in, like another Udi or another Runica. Also, it runs one Udi, which, again, not super popular, but very good. Single Udi for Crest isn't bad. Having the chance to draw when you're low on cards or having the chance to heal a little bit is always pretty valuable. You can get away with Bullet from Beyond being something else as well, like Heavenly Thunder, stuff like that. Just more removal options. You have some good things that you can kind of mess around and swap. This deck could also be ran as a reasonable budget option. If you drop the Udi and the Orcus and just focus on Realmir, and then a few more generation cards in the artifact category, you can definitely run this in a budget orientation, and I do have that on my channel if you want to check that out. It's another very solid option if you want to go budget, and it works pretty well. So a deck that I'm not super comfortable with, but has been probably the best performing deck, nearly. Up there with Sword, honestly. Roach. If you look at win rates for this deck and you look at some of the top players, they've just been straight up playing Forest Roach for like the whole game at this point, and it's doing exceptionally well in that category. I personally don't find it to be that strong, at least when I'm versing it. I don't know if I'm just lucky and I'm facing a lot of bad Roach players, but hey, this is one of the highest skill ceiling decks when you've got to work out, you know, how to go for your Roach math and make all the plays you need to make for sure. It's definitely up there in that category. So this one's running the double Aria, the double Olivia. Like I said, Olivia is very popular. You'll see a lot of Olivia in these decks. It's great for mid-game pressure and late-game pressure, so not a surprise. And the double Aria is just your extra Storm. This gets you there a lot of the time. You can run this as a budget variant, just drop Aria and Olivia and put in some other generator cards, because honestly, Roach is your big finisher card, being just a gold, and Aria is more of a nice-to-have. If you can fit in the Arias, I recommend running at least 2 of them, but Olivia could easily be cut for anything, really, at this point. Even Selwyn, the silver card, is very, very good in that 7-cost slot because it does have Storm and it does help you remove threats that are big wards. So very good option if you want to run a budget Roach deck. Very easy to do and pretty solid deck. But it does have a steep learning curve, so I don't recommend a new player just jumping in and trying this deck for the tournament. I'd recommend only experienced players or people who have the time to at least practice with the deck a little bit beforehand to get a feel for it. But otherwise, very, very good. Now we move on to some budget options. I will go over Aggro Dragon. This can actually also be converted to a budget deck. I didn't cover it while we were looking at it a minute ago, but basically just drop the Olivias, run the Forte, and put anything else that you kind of want for Storm or small cards in here, and you can turn this into a budget deck pretty easily. I look at budget decks as any deck that runs just 3 of any legendary or less, and at that point you are in the budget category, so that's what I look at, especially when most decks are running anywhere between 9 to 12 legendaries on average. So, budget HavenCraft. So this deck is similar to our previous one, but not quite. We're running less of the Amulet summons outside of Winged Statue. It's the only one that's actually in this deck. I haven't tested a lot of this deck so far, but it is very similar to standard Fatigue Haven, running a good chunk of removal with Dark Haven healing and stuff like that. You're just not including water. Water would be a good option in this deck if you want to move closer to Fatigue Haven, and you can check out my Fatigue Haven video if you're interested in that deck, as that would be closer to running a full kit. But this one just runs the Gene, the Lapis, the removal cards, and should perform reasonably well, especially against some of the more aggressive matchups. Although, again, without water for extra healing, it does fall a little bit flat, but I think it's a good option if you are short on cards, but you have the Janes. It's not a bad one. And then Budget Sword, probably one of the better budget decks next to like Forest. Forest is probably the best budget deck, but again has a really high skill ceiling. Sword is pretty easy, you just run a lot of follower generation, very similar to normal Sword, but we're running a couple of different ones in like Squirrel and stuff like that since we don't have as big a high end. And then you run a handful of golds as well in Vals for your removal, Zirconia for your Swarm, and Geno for more Swarm. I'm a big fan of Geno. I would run Geno in almost every Sword deck I can early on because it is an extremely powerful card for both removal and board Swarm. And then Lord Luminous Magnus is really good as well, another Swarm card. You could run Amelia instead, which is the 8-drop as well. I could, if you have that, put that in here. Maybe drop some of these Lovebound Swords or something, although, yeah, the bust's kind of nice. You could probably just slot it in somewhere, though. Ancestral Crown's also a pretty decent early card, as it does allow you to stay out of range of Apollo plays, which, honestly, thinking about it, not many of these decks are running Apollo, which is surprising, but more people are just running custom removal or just focusing on getting their own aggressive plays, so I am seeing less and less Apollo as I go higher and higher up in the ranks, so I guess it's not a surprise, but that does about cover it, though. That is basically every deck. I've got at least one deck for every craft here that you guys can look at. We've got a couple of budget options and ways to convert about 3 of these decks into budget-style decks pretty easily, and hopefully you guys will enjoy it. I will leave all these decks in the description below. You can find the links under these names and titles, so if you do want to check any of these out, you can easily look at them, and hopefully you guys have a good tournament. So until next time, guys, see ya.